Thank you for joining us. I'm joined by Representative Peter King, the former chairman and ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, which I point out because one of the arguments that has been made, I think not entirely validly about this, is that if you do not ban internet gambling, it will somehow be a channel for people who wish this country ill. And I don't think anyone has a better reputation or record for trying to protect us against that sort of thing than Mr. King. So I particularly welcome his advocacy. I am introducing today with a bipartisan group of sponsors, including Mr. King and Ron Paul, and then many Democrats from our committee, legislation that would do two things, two bills. One, to repeal the bill that was passed as part of an appropriations bill omnibus to make it illegal to use the internet for gambling. And secondly, to suspend for a year the regulations that were adopted very late in the Bush administration to implement that. Those are regulations which draft the banking industry of America into being the enforcers of this scheme. When we had a hearing on it, the chief regulators involved from the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, made it very clear that they did not think this was a job that could be done well. There continues to be a gap, for instance, in an answer to the question about whether or not horse race betting is covered. But the banks find this very much of a burden at a time when that's the last thing we should be doing. But my fundamental reasons for doing this are that the government should not interfere with people's liberty unless there was a good reason. I think what John Stuart Mill said in On Liberty, I have the quote again, 150 years ago, still holds. We have a right and obligation to protect people against other people. It is a great mistake to protect people against themselves. And I do think that some of my more conservative friends have been somewhat inconsistent. When we dealt with some of the legislative matters recently, I've heard a lot of criticism of the nanny state. Well, I don't understand why this principle that individuals should be free to make their own choices does not apply to the right of individual adults to gamble with their own money. It is also a glaring exception to the policy that many have argued that we should respect the freedom of the internet. This singles out internet gambling. This is, I believe, the single biggest example of an intrusion into the principle that people should be free to do things on the internet. In fact, it is clearly the case that gambling is an activity which in many cases can be done offline but not online. I thought that was the very reverse of what many people wanted to see, or at least a great breach of that. People can gamble offline in many ways, at racetracks, in certain states, in casinos all over this country. And the principle that you should be able to gamble offline but not online seems to me, first of all, an intrusion in personal liberty, and secondly, a problem with regard to the consistency there. The argument we have heard then as well, but people will gamble online who shouldn't gamble online. We let people do a lot of things online. I shouldn't even say let people do. We recognize people's rights to do things online that adults should do and children shouldn't do. The sale of alcohol, the sale of tobacco. There are things, I have to say this, the notion that a society should prohibit something entirely because of the possibility that children will abuse it is a terrible blow to liberty. Our obligation is to try and differentiate. We believe that it is very possible to come up with regulations that deal with this. As I've said, there have been arguments that, well, this will be a cover for illicit activities that might threaten the United States. Again, that's why I'm so pleased to be joined by a man whose credentials in the area of protecting the United States are unsurpassed by anybody else. But the fundamental, let me put it to you, one of the colleagues I most respect said on the floor of the House in the debate on this, it was never debated in the Senate, it did pass the House. I think a lot of my colleagues voted for a thing that would never go anywhere. It was then stuck into an appropriations bill inappropriately. One of my colleagues said, well, one of the reasons we could ban this is that it contributes nothing to the gross domestic product. I cannot think of a more chilling argument. The notion that individuals should have to justify by showing some addition to the gross domestic product activities in which they wish to engage is outrageous. And the final point is, am I saying in this that we are encouraging gambling or approving gambling? No. there was a great mistake in the philosophy of some of my colleagues and others, which is that human activity in this country should be divided into two things: things the government prohibits and things the government approves or encourages. In fact, most human activity should be neither of the above. It should be things that people do if they want to, that the government ought to stay out of. The notion that if the government doesn't make something a crime, it is encouraging it, is a terrible threat to personal liberty. And the notion that we should be assuming that if it's not criminal, the government wants you to do it, totally misunderstands the notion of a free society. I will just say in closing, I'm going to call on my colleague. I hope to deal with these in committee. We have a couple other things on the agenda you might have noticed, like regulating the financial structure of the country. But it is my intention to move on this legislation before the break in August. And now, Mr. King.
I want to thank Chairman Frank for introducing this legislation. To me, it just reaffirms a belief that many of us have that prohibition does not work. In this situation in particular, the regulations, the controls that Chairman Frank has included in this legislation regarding young people gambling, regarding money laundering, all of those to me should answer any reasonable objections that people would have to the whole concept of online gambling. To me, there's also a loss of revenue here. Whether or not it adds to the gross domestic product, the fact is that people are going offshore to gamble. And as a result of that, we are losing revenue here in the United States. So that is not the controlling issue here, but it's certainly something in tough times that should be factored in to those who are looking at it through an accounting perspective. But with that, I just believe that this is legislation that is going to pass. We did make progress in the last Congress. And as Chairman Frank said, there are real problems with those regulations, the impact they're having on banks. And that is something which also has to be addressed, but it rises out of the initial legislation that was passed. So, again, I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of the legislation. I look forward to working in a bipartisan way with the Chairman to do what we have to do to get the legislation through, passed, and to the President.
One other thing I want to add, and then we'll throw it open. Among the inconsistencies are those who have positioned themselves as the strongest defenders of the World Trade Organization and our obligations thereunder. This violates the WTO. This bill has been found to be in violation of the WTO. We have had requests for compensation. We've had a grant compensation. There's currently one with the European Union. And particularly, some of my conservative friends and people in the previous administration, if the WTO was sacrosanct when it cost the jobs of American workers, I don't understand why it is so flexible when it comes to embodying their particular personal preferences about how people ought to spend their money. And as Mr. King correctly pointed out, there's a revenue aspect here. That's not why we're doing it. We're doing it for personal liberty. But there is money that goes now. And people say, well, this could fund illegal activities. If you want to make sure that something funds illegal activities, make it illegal. Then by definition it does. We believe that the experience with other things is this. Have the kind of regulations that are reasonable, that don't interfere with people's ability to do it, and you diminish the extent to which it's illegal and make some money. We'll throw it open now. Yes.